Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com. Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome, everyone, to our webinar presented as a partnership between Build Consulting and Community IT Innovators. In this webinar, Build Consulting's panel of experts will be answering the questions you submitted regarding selecting nonprofit software. My name is Peter Miras, and I'm serving as the moderator and as a panelist for today's discussion.
I'm David Deal, founding partner at Build Consulting.
Kyle Haynes, partner at Build Consulting.
How do we define the requirements for the software that we need? I'll take an initial stab at that and then hand it off to you, Kyle, to fill out my answer. I think there's a number of different ways to approach it, but one of the things that I often prioritize is sort of for the business requirements, identify the specific workflows that are required to support from the system. So if I'm looking at a CRM system, for example, I might say, well, the constituent lifecycle for this particular client starts with marketing. So that's when you're sort of identifying as of yet unknown constituents, and then all the way through when that constituent is no longer engaged with the organization and all the steps in between. And those are all different process areas that often will need to be accounted for in a CRM system or other pieces that are integrated with a CRM system. So it often starts just with mapping out the business life cycle associated with a particular part of the organization at a high level, and then really diving down into the specifics. And then you also have to look at the non-business requirements, the technical requirements, such as integration with other third-party tools or the capabilities of the API solution. So broadly speaking, we're breaking things down into business requirements and technical requirements, and then within business requirements, we're breaking it down into the entire process or processes that need to have requirements developed in all their individual steps, as well as who's performing those steps and what functional areas of the organization those people fit within. Kyle, what would you add to that?
I like how you drew the distinction between business requirements and technical requirements, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I think oftentimes what people get hung up on is creating a massive list, usually in Excel, of every single requirement that they need. And for those of you who know me, and David and Peter certainly know this, I love analogies. So this has probably been the longest I've ever gone without using an analogy. But at the risk of an analogy falling flat, I think that sometimes those lists in Excel of every single requirement that you need is a little bit like going to shop for a new car and listing out that you need a horn, you need a seatbelt, you're going to need an airbag, and you're going to need a backup camera. And I use this analogy because every single car has these things now, even a backup camera. I think post-2017, every car has to come with a backup camera. So sharing that information with vendors is not particularly helpful. They're going to tell you that they have a backup camera. What's important is for the organization to understand, are you looking for a sports car? Are you looking for a sedan? A minivan? Do you need an SUV? And if you're getting an SUV, how big of a garage are you going to need? Are you going to be able to park that that SUV in the garage? How much is insurance going to be for that new car? How much are the oil changes? And I use that example because I remember right out of college buying an SUV as an impulse purchase and going out to buy new tires and figuring out exactly how much new tires for an SUV cost. So had I done that research in advance, I might not have landed on the same type of car. And so where I would take that analogy back to the question is that it's really important to not get hung up on the stuff that are table stakes in any new software. It's important to understand how does your organization want to work in the future, as David said, and then finding software that can meet those needs and match where you want to go.
I think that's a great answer, and it kind of dovetails into one of the things that I often do during this sort of RFI response process, and when the vendors are putting their proposals in or you're having dialogue with them, even ahead of that, maybe when you're actually deciding which vendors to circulate the RFP to, and that's sort of create a short list of those really important business and technical requirements that would be, the absence of which would be a real deal breaker, and just have conversations with those vendors and have them prove to you, to the extent that that's possible, how they can check those boxes. And unless you've really drilled down to identify what's most important, you're not going to be able to do that. And that really eliminates so much work in the RFP vendor response evaluation process, because if you're just publicly posting an RFP and you're getting responses from 12 different people, you have to try to do apples to apples comparisons across 12 different vendors. It can be a real time sink. So being able to have this prioritized requirements really allows you to filter out a lot of noise and just say, okay, these are the three vendors that, based on these knockout requirements, we have a reasonable level of certainty are going to be able to put in a good response, and then just circulate it to those, 2 to 4 companies.
I really like what you said about figuring out what's important, and it's amazing when we start these processes sometimes how there'll be a lot of divergence internally before it's even gone to a vendor about whether something's really important or whether something's a nice to have. And you want to have those conversations before you're making the final selection, not in the selection process itself. That's not the time you want to figure out what things are nice to haves and which things are important.
We have a couple of questions or comments from the group here. One of the people put his name in there, Kyle. You may know who this person is. I won't share his name here, but he asked, "Is there a way I can make our CEO watch this presentation with his eyes pinned open, like in Clockwork Orange?" I think the answer to that is no. I wish that were true on some occasions. Yeah, I think the answer to that is no, but whoever asked that question, if you come up with any innovations that fall short of torturous methods, let us know. Another person asks, I've always used the language of functional requirements and information requirements. Do those map to your use of the terms technical requirements and business requirements, or do they represent something different? That's a great question. So for us, functional requirements maps to business requirements, and I don't know, I haven't used the term information requirements before, but we've also used the term non-functional requirements to match to technical requirements. I suspect that if information requirements are met within the context of sort of data relationship or management requirements or sort of back-end technical considerations, then that probably does match to technical requirements. Feel free to keep those questions coming. Here's the next question. When is an RFP, request for proposal, or RFI, request for information, appropriate in a software selection? And I just want to say before I tee this up for David that for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to use RFP and RFI interchangeably. We're aware that they're defined differently by some people in the industry, but the bottom line is that you're looking to put a document out there that has a set of requirements and get vendors to respond to it. When is it appropriate to do that? David?
So I'll start by saying, Peter, when you were talking about 12 vendors in an RFP process, that made me break out in a cold sweat. What a nightmare for everyone involved, the vendors and the people who have to read 12 proposals. So really, like you said, it's important to get that list down to a manageable list, 2 to maybe 5 at the most. But when to do the process at all, I think clearly you don't want to go through an RFP process for something that is, more trivial, a lower dollar spend or impacts a small number of people. Whether to go with Evernote or OneNote or something else, or what to use for personal task management. Of course, these aren't things that are big enough in scope to have an RFP. I'll also say that sometimes there are compliance requirements. We won't get into that, but if one of your funders says, we need to make sure that you've gone through a due diligence process, RFP, it's published in these places, clearly you need to do it there. In general, though, what would guide for me whether to go through an RFP process is the scope of the effort. It has to be large enough to warrant your investment of time in the RFI process. And by your, I mean yours personally, as well as everyone else in the organization who's going to participate in that. And secondly, it's got to warrant the vendor's time that they'll have to invest in creating a response. So, if it's a $10,000 project, frankly, it better be a pretty short RFP, or you're going to find a lot of vendors won't respond. And some vendors won't respond to RFPs, RFIs at all. And maybe they're not the right vendor for you. If your process is large enough to where you really need to have a conversation with prospective vendors to understand what they can do, and you really need a demo of their software, those are pretty clear indicators that you would benefit from a more structured process that would typically involve an RFP or an RFI. The final thing I'll say here is that the length of the RFI or RFP should match the breadth of the project. So maybe you can do a very brief RFP for that $10,000 project, but that's brief is certainly far short of 50 pages or longer RFPs that I've seen.
I would add that, I agree with all of that. And I think in an earlier question, what I talked about is that perhaps the biggest value from thinking about this as an RFP process might be internally only. It might be something that never gets shared with a vendor, and it is an opportunity to document how it is that the organization wants to work. I think what I would add to David, to what you said, is that the more inflexible your business requirements are, the way that you work, I think the more important RFP becomes. If there's not an openness or a willingness to change how you approach specific processes, then it's really important to understand how that software is going to work. If it's more of a conversation and you want the vendor to bring their approach to a specific business process, then the RFP becomes either less important, or the amount of detail that's contained in the RFP goes down commensurately.
Those are great points, guys. I think that it's worth touching on the possible alternative approaches. Some vendors out there just don't work within the RFP or RFI context. They make robust trial or demo environments available, or free trials, so you can test drive the software, and that's how they really want you to encounter its use. And so you'll see vendors, particularly if you're at a smaller scale of organization, are going to try to push you towards that sort of experience. That usually takes place when a product is more well-defined, and there's less sort of configurable options. There's still some options, but not so much that you couldn't get a great feel for what the software is like or whether it's appropriate for your organization by just investing time and doing some test driving. Another approach is to just, if you're pretty sure what class of solution you want to go to, or you're pretty sure that, let's just say Dynamics, Microsoft Dynamics 365 could meet your accounting needs, you might just want to start with a software vendor or maybe one or two that's well regarded within that space, and start exploring the solution with them. Sort of say, hey, this is what we're thinking. Can you help us sort of put some parameters around it? Rather than going through a formal RFP or RFI process, at least at first. I think you'd want to make sure that the vendor had a great reputation for really investing with the nonprofit community and helping them to advance the nonprofit community to advance itself as well as their own business interests before taking such an approach. And there are vendors out there that are like that. We touched on system demos a little bit already, but the next question is, one, when should we let the vendors demo, and how do we ensure vendors show us what we need to see and not what they want to show us? David?
So I'll start by saying, Peter, you bring up, in response to the previous question, you brought up a good alternative, which is if it's a smaller, kind of more tactical software decision, then just test driving it is a good option. So an assumption here is that it's a type of software or it's a big enough project that it warrants a demo versus that download and try type of model. So I think it's okay to have brief initial demos before you start an RFI or RFP process to learn, particularly if you need to learn what current capabilities of software out there in a certain space are, if you need to learn what a new category of software can do. So I think that can provide helpful ideas and plant some seeds. I think it is important to make sure that vendors know when they're doing that this is just a quick initial demo to give you some ideas, and that there will be a more formal process later. So once the RFI, RFP process starts, I really think that you need to control the demos and sequence them such that it's after vendors have responded to the RFP. So after they have invested some time in responding, after you've read their responses, and only if you continue to believe that they're a legitimate contender to be your selection, at that point, I really think they should participate in a demo where you've laid out, this is what we want to do. Here are the 3 things, the 6 things, the 10 kind of workflows that we have. Show us how your software supports those workflows. And so this isn't something you're going to see in 30 minutes. Demos that are really effective would typically be a few hours.
I would add, and I think, I don't remember whether it was you, David, or you, Peter, using the example of 12 vendors responding to an RFP. I think Build oftentimes has to respond to RFPs. It is a labor-intensive, time-intensive process. And I try to create respectful processes where you're going to vendors who legitimately have a chance of winning the work. And I think one of the ways that you can be respectful is you've got to find a way to let vendors show off. And the point of the RFP process is to give them a bit of space to do that, but not to spend too much time showing off stuff that isn't important. So, for example, if a vendor spends a bunch of time in a demo talking about their Facebook integration, but your organization doesn't use Facebook because it works with a bunch of confidentiality requirements, that's just going to waste everybody's time. I think you have to recognize, though, vendors come to this wanting to show their best side, and it is a balancing act to give them the space to do that while also not wasting everybody's time with them showing you things that you really don't care about or are not that important.
Those are great points, and we often refer to scripted demos rather than just demos, and David and Kyle both alluded to this, but we help our clients come up with scripts about what specifically they want to see in the nuances of that, and then we circulate that to vendors and give them some room to provide input onto what else they might want to show. So you make sure that there are no surprises in the demos because you want the expectations to be good on both sides, from the vendor for what the client is expecting and how they can show off a little bit, but still keep within the context of what the client wants to see, and for the nonprofit organization towards the vendor, knowing that they have given vendor clear expectations to work with for the demos, and if there's something outside of that that interferes with the goals of the demo or the benefit for the nonprofit organization, that they can rightly judge the vendor negatively based on that. How can we make sure a vendor is giving us a realistic project estimate? I'll take the lead on this one. I think we often talk about total cost of ownership and TCO, taking all of that what's entailed there into consideration, not just licensing and the initial vendor implementation costs, but also initial and ongoing training and support, internal staff time commitments associated with the selection process, with the implementation process. That has a real cost to it, even if the organization doesn't often quantify, and from a dollar standpoint, it's internal time commitments. There are costs in change management. There's a variety of different scoping things that you sort of need to check the boxes on, and you can't always require or count on vendors to take those things into consideration, some of which they arguably should but don't, and you have to encourage them to provide additional information, such as real costs for enhanced support, for example. Or they might not do it because you need to do it for yourself internally. It's hard for them to put a time estimate on what it's going to take for you internally to go through an implementation. They might be able to help ballpark that for you, particularly after initial design phase, but rarely in response to the RFP are they going to be able to give you that kind of an estimate. And that's really, so I just make 2 points. One, take total cost of ownership into consideration and everything that entails. And two, recognize that there's going to be some collaborative give and take with the vendor to arrive at an accurate figure.
I think one of the biggest areas in terms of getting a realistic project estimate where people go over budget is when, and I think I mentioned this earlier, when the vendor underestimates how much time it's going to take to lead the organization in an implementation through the decision-making process. So, for example, probably my best example at 4:45 or 4:50 in the afternoon is if you, for example, are implementing financial software and you've never tracked receivables before, and they're estimating something really low to implement accounts receivable, that's a red flag for me. Assume that gaining consensus on the right way to do things in the implementation is going to take significant time. You know your organization better than they do. If something seems like they're underestimating how long it's going to take, you should call that out and try to understand why they've estimated it so low. And vendors, my experience, they often think they're going to walk into a meeting room, have a design session, present some options for your team, and you're going to choose at the end of that hour-long meeting the best option and move on. And I think any of us who have been through a implementation know that that's rarely how the process works. So I think that I would encourage you to look carefully at the estimates for the professional services specifically, and do they have a realistic understanding of how long it will take to make decisions in the process, in the implementation process itself.
I think I'll just add a few things to this. One, let's just say it's very tough. I mean, vendors really, a lot of times it's a shot in the dark. If it's an enterprise implementation, they cannot realistically know what it's going to take when they provide the initial bid. They should go through a discovery process, a phase one of their project where they are defining the requirements in more detail. So because of this, it's so important to go into this project with a contingency fund, a significant contingency fund. The second thing I'll say is that multiple estimates certainly help. So if you're considering Salesforce, or if you're considering another piece of software where one firm sells the software and another firm is responsible for implementing it, try to get bids from multiple systems implementation firms. So the companies that will help you to configure and customize your application, because it could be the same piece of software, but they could have very different processes with very different costs for implementing that software. And finally, it's really important to understand the type of implementation they're proposing. Not all implementations are the same. So one major vendor typically proposes a boilerplate. Best practice implementation is what they call it. And in this process, you essentially are expected to fill in a worksheet to indicate what your needs are. So what I want to say is, most of the time that's grossly insufficient for really configuring a system to do what you need it to do. So just be careful if it's a, quote, best practice or boilerplate implementation. And, really, I prefer ones where the vendor is planning to do a full requirements discovery as part of their implementation process.
I can't wait to use grossly insufficient in a meeting. That is absolutely fantastic. Hopefully it's not directed at me.
No promises.
We have one question left that we need to get to, and we need to cover it quickly, although it's a big topic. It's about change management, and so we can spend about 3 to 4 minutes on it before we need to close out. And the question is, any change involves a cost to the institution. So how do you weigh the benefits versus cost? If, for example, retraining all users. We spoke to this already a little bit, but Kyle, do you have a quick answer for this?
I don't have I can answer it quickly. I probably don't have a quick answer. It's tough. I think if you're replacing a product, like an accounting system, it may be easier to quantify the benefit and the costs. If it's something brand new for the organization, like social listening as an example, it can be much more difficult. And I would say that when I've served as an interim CIO, it's rarefied air to be able to work in organizations on projects that are technology-centric that really involve taking the organization in a brand new direction. And oftentimes, those are the projects that it's most difficult to quantify the ROI. I think, just to hit on a point that I made earlier, the ROI will be immeasurably greater if it's that type of entrepreneurial project. If you can get everyone in the organization to pull in the same direction and the leadership of that organization to put their stamp of approval and sing it from the mountaintops about how important that project is, and that the ROI of that project will really be determined by how much the organization puts its weight behind that project.
Yeah, I would say that's right. And, for return on investment or ROI, I think we asked, again, what is the perceived benefit? And another way to ask that is, what can the organization do better or differently, and how would you quantify that? As Kyle said, where something is newer to the organization, it might be more difficult, but there might be some relevant success stories from other organizations that have attempted similar things, and that might give you some realistic benefit targets that will help you say, from a quantifiable standpoint, what it would be worth it for us to undertake this change. So there's several different ways of getting at it. As I said before, also organizations often don't do a good job of quantifying the soft costs, as we would call them, associated with the change. So those are your internal staff time for the most part. So having some experience from an experienced third party like Build Consulting, for example, can help estimate that, since we have experience across tons of implementations, and we will have some corollaries that we can associate with your particular situation and help you identify things like internal time commitments and the costs of those relative to undertaking a selection and implementation initiatives. David, do you have anything that you'd like to quickly add on to that?
I do. I'll say that TCO, total cost of ownership, direct costs, soft costs, the numbers you get out of that process, it's one helpful data point. It's not a numbers-based decision exclusively, though, right? I think it's incredibly important to recognize that really this comes down to a judgment call by leadership. There's some things that there's some ways in which it's a subjective decision, not a data-driven decision. So although you may suspect it will take, let's say, 800 to 1,200 hours of staff time for an implementation, okay, great, but how maxed out are your staff already? Is your organization already stretched because you've been growing 50% year over year for the past 3 years? Will you have to backfill some of the work that those staff need to do as part of implementation, incurring more direct costs in the process? For the leaders, I would say, are there things that are a lower priority that staff can stop doing while they're supporting implementation? Helping staff understand what they can stop doing, to me, is one of the most important roles of leadership, so they can focus on what's most important. How much change have staff recently gone through? what other priorities does the organization have, and can a major enterprise technology change effort be I would say typically a top 3 priority for that organization for the duration of implementation. If it can't be, probably not in a place where you can do that. So it's not it can't purely be a data-driven decision. There are definitely some subjective elements to this decision.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's been an honor to be with you. We do really enjoy dialoguing with folks out there in the community, so feel free to reach out to us. Thanks, Kyle, for being with us today.
Absolutely.
Thanks, David.
Sure thing.
Take care, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.